The rain fell in sheets, a gray curtain turning the world to water and shadow. Inside the dusty roadside tavern known as the Crow's Nest, the only sounds were the low murmur of conversation, the clink of glass, and the steady hum of a neon beer sign flickering in the gloom. Then the door crashed open. A woman, Sarah, stood silhouetted against the storm, her frame trembling, her hand clutching the smaller hand of her son, Leo. Water dripped from her hair onto the warped wooden floorboards, each drop a tiny percussive beat in the sudden silence. Every head in the bar turned. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of wet wool, sawdust, and something sharp and metallic, like fear. Leo, all of 8 years old, with eyes that held the ancient gravity of a much older soul, pressed himself against his mother's leg. His knuckles were white where he gripped a rolled-up tube of drawing paper, his only shield against the world. He could feel the vibrations through the floor, a deep, resonant thrum that wasn't from the storm outside. It was the collective stillness of the men who occupied the back of the room. They were large men, draped in worn leather vests, bearing the insignia of a three-headed wolf and the words Sentinels MC below it. They were not just bikers, they were an institution in this forgotten corner of the county, a brotherhood whose quiet presence was as much a part of the landscape as the ancient oaks lining the highway. Sarah's voice was a raw whisper, barely audible over the drumming rain. "He's after me," she breathed, her gaze darting toward the darkness beyond the door. "He's after my boy." A shadow detached itself from the storm, a man's figure, tall and broad, moving with an unhurried confidence that was more menacing than any sprint. The headlights of his luxury sedan cut through the deluge, illuminating his expensive overcoat and the predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. Inside, a subtle shift occurred. It began not with a sound, but with a feeling, a change in pressure. The president of the Sentinels, a man they called Forge, set his glass down on the scarred wooden table. The sound was soft, deliberate, yet it echoed in the cavernous silence. He was a man built of iron and patience, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder decisions. His eyes, the color of faded denim, met Sarah's, then flickered down to the boy who was trying to make himself invisible. He saw the terror in the mother, but he recognized something else in the child. A defiant stillness, a refusal to completely break. Forge pushed his chair back, the legs scraping a sharp complaint against the floor. He rose, not quickly, but with the undeniable momentum of a freight train, starting its slow, inexorable journey. And as he stood, so did another, then two more, then all of them, in a single unified motion, born of years of unspoken understanding. 30 men got to their feet. 30 leather-clad giants, their faces grim, their bodies forming a silent, immovable wall between the woman, the child, and the door. The low rumble of their collective movement was the sound of a promise being made. There was no shouting, no posturing. There was only the quiet, absolute certainty of a line being drawn. The world outside could rage, but inside the Crow's Nest, the storm had just met a mountain. The man in the expensive coat stopped at the edge of the porch light, his smile faltering as he peered into the dim tavern, seeing not a frightened woman and a child, but a silent army that had just claimed them as their own. And in that moment, everything changed, because you do not see a child in fear and do nothing. Not if you are a sentinel. It is the first rule, the only rule that truly matters. Leo had learned to be quiet long before the storm. The silence had started months ago, on the day the world went colorless and smelled of dust and damp earth. He remembered the raw, gaping hole in the side of the old mill, the one his father had been hired to help tear down. He remembered the shouts, the sirens that seemed to scream his own name, and the way his mother had folded into herself, becoming a small, fragile thing. His father, a man who had seemed as strong and permanent as the sun, was gone. The official report called it a tragic accident, a structural collapse, unforeseeable. But Leo knew how to watch. He had his father's eyes, the kind that noticed the small things, the hairline crack in a coffee mug, the way a loose board on the porch steps sighed before it snapped, the subtle shift in a person's face when they were telling a lie. After his father's death, Mr. Alistair Finch had appeared. He owned the development company that had bought the old mill property. He arrived at their small apartment with casseroles and condolences, his voice a smooth, comforting balm that made Sarah's shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. He spoke of a trust fund for Leo, of a new job for Sarah in his downtown office once she was ready. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose name was on park benches and the new wing of the local library. To everyone else, he was a savior. To Leo, he was a shadow with teeth. Leo watched him from the living room window. He saw the way Mr. Finch's smile never quite touched his eyes. He saw how he would stand on the sidewalk, talking on his phone, his face twisting into a mask of cold fury when he thought no one was looking. Leo started drawing him. In his sketchbook, Mr. Finch was a tall, sharp-angled figure, all straight lines and dark colors. Leo's father, in his memory, was drawn with soft, curved lines and bright yellows. The silence at home grew deeper. Sarah was adrift in her grief, trying to navigate a world of insurance forms and sympathetic whispers. She clung to Mr. Finch's promises like a life raft. "He's a good man, Leo," she would say, her voice thin. "He's helping us." But Leo saw the flicker of fear in her eyes when Mr. Finch's car pulled up, the way she would unconsciously straighten her spine, as if preparing for a blow. He was helping them, but it felt like they were being caged. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Leo was sitting on the fire escape, a perch that gave him a clear view of the alley behind their building. It was also a shortcut to the demolition site. He saw Mr. Finch arrive, not in his fancy sedan, but in a dusty truck. Another man was with him, a man in a hard hat who looked nervous, his hands constantly fidgeting. Leo, hidden by a tangle of overgrown ivy, watched them walk toward the remaining section of the old mill's foundation, the very section that had collapsed. Mr. Finch pointed at the wall, his voice a low, angry growl that carried on the wind. The man in the hard hat shook his head. Mr. Finch then took out a thick, white envelope and pushed it into the man's chest. The man took it, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Leo's pencil flew across the page. He didn't know the words for what he was seeing: bribery, corruption, conspiracy, but he knew how to draw the truth. He drew the sagging posture of the second man, the aggressive point of Mr. Finch's finger, the fatness of the envelope. He drew the cracks in the brick wall behind them, cracks he had seen his father photograph and complain about just a week before the accident. He drew what he knew. Later that evening, Mr. Finch had come to their apartment for a check-in. He had seen the open sketchbook on the coffee table. He had picked it up. His smile vanished. A cold, flat look replaced it, an expression Leo had only seen on the man's face from the fire escape. Mr. Finch had looked from the drawing to Leo, and in that instant, the boy understood he had crossed a dangerous line. He had not just seen something, he had recorded it. He had become a witness. That was when the running started. It began as a frantic grab for coats and keys, a desperate flight into the rainy night, with Mr. Finch's car pulling out of its parking space right behind them, his intentions no longer hidden behind a mask of charity. The Sentinel's clubhouse was a converted warehouse on the industrial edge of town, a place that smelled of motor oil, old leather, and coffee that had been brewing for hours. It was a sanctuary built of concrete and steel, but its true foundation was loyalty. Inside, away from the prying eyes of the world, the club operated by a code as unyielding as the chrome on their motorcycles. They were men who had been failed by the systems meant to protect them. Veterans cast aside, factory workers laid off, men who had seen the hollowness of promises made by politicians and corporations. They had built their own system, one based on respect earned, not given, and a fierce, uncompromising defense of their own. Forge, the president, had spent 20 years in a steel mill before it was shut down by a parent company that outsourced his entire life's work overnight. He learned then that a man's strength wasn't in his back, but in his spine. He founded the Sentinels not as a gang, but as a bulwark. They fixed bikes for free for kids in the neighborhood, organized toy drives at Christmas, and kept a quiet, watchful eye on the town. Their presence was a low-frequency hum of order in a world that often felt chaotic. They were misunderstood, often feared, but they didn't care. Their reputation was a shield, a buffer that kept trouble at bay. They knew who they were, and that was enough. Silas, the sergeant-at-arms, was the club's enforcer, but his enforcement was one of discipline, not violence. An ex-Army Ranger, he moved with a silent economy of motion, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing threats before they could materialize. He had seen the worst of humanity in far-off deserts and had come home with a profound understanding that the only real evil is the abuse of power, especially over those who have none. He saw that evil in the swagger of a bully, the condescension of a corrupt official, and the predatory smile of a man like Alistair Finch. Silas was the one who taught the younger members that true strength was the control you maintained, the fight you chose to walk away from, and the one you absolutely had to finish. Then there was Book. His real name was Marcus, and he had a paralegal certificate and a mind that was a steel trap for laws, statutes, and loopholes. He had once dreamed of being a lawyer, but grew disillusioned with a justice system that seemed to favor the wealthy and well-connected. In the Sentinels, he found a different kind of justice. He kept the club's finances, navigated their legal standings, and served as the calm, rational voice in moments of high emotion. He understood that the modern battlefield was often fought with paperwork and procedure. While Forge was the heart of the club and Silas its fist, Book was its formidable brain. Their meeting that night at the Crow's Nest had been a standard one, discussing a fundraiser for a local family whose house had burned down, planning a security detail for the town's summer festival. It was the routine business of their quiet stewardship. They operated on a simple principle: you protect your community. Not just the roads or the businesses, but the people, especially the ones who fall through the cracks, the vulnerable, the forgotten, the silenced. When Sarah and Leo had burst through that door, they hadn't just run into a bar. They had stumbled into the one place where their fear would be understood not as a weakness, but as a call to arms. The Sentinels' code wasn't written on paper, it was etched into their character, and that code demanded they act. They had seen a child in danger. For them, the world had just simplified into a single, clear objective. The moment hung, suspended in the rain-soaked air. Alistair Finch stood on the porch, his expensive suit now looking flimsy and absurd against the backdrop of the storm. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for the tavern door, his face arranged into a mask of paternal concern. "Sarah, thank God," he said, his voice projecting a smooth, practiced sincerity. "You and Leo running off like that, I was so worried." He pushed the door open and stepped inside, bringing with him the chill of the night. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene: Sarah, pale and trembling, the boy, half hidden behind a wall of leather, and the silent, unmoving figures of the Sentinels. For a flicker of a second, his composure broke. Annoyance, sharp and ugly, crossed his features before being smoothed over again. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone dismissive, as if addressing the furniture, "there seems to be a misunderstanding. This is a private family matter. Sarah is overwrought. He took another step toward her, his hand outstretched. Come on, Sarah, let's get you and Leo home. You're not well. Forge didn't move from his spot, but his presence seemed to expand, filling the space between Finch and the family he had just claimed. She's not going anywhere with you. The words were quiet, a low rumble that carried more weight than any shout. Finch's smile tightened. I don't believe we've been introduced. I am Alistair Finch. I'm a friend of the family. We know who you are, Forge replied, his gaze unwavering. As Finch tried to maneuver around him to get closer to Sarah, Leo did something unexpected. The boy, who had been a study in terrified stillness, took a stumbling step forward. His small hand opened, and the roll of drawing paper he had been clutching fell to the floor, uncurling near the toe of Forge's boot. On the paper, rendered in the stark, honest lines of a child, was the scene from the alley. Two figures, one tall and imposing, with angry, slanted eyebrows, unmistakably Finch. The other, a smaller man in a hard hat, his head bowed, and between them, a thick rectangle with a dollar sign crudely drawn on it, passing from the tall man to the small one. In the background was a crumbling brick wall with jagged lines indicating a collapse. It was a confession in graphite and crayon. Forge bent down slowly, his knees cracking a little, and picked up the drawing. He held it up, his eyes moving from the child's stark depiction of the truth to the carefully constructed lie standing before him. He saw it all in that moment, the greed, the callousness, the corruption that led to a good man's death. He looked at Finch, and his expression was one of cold, final judgment. The boy draws what he sees, Forge said, his voice flat. He held up the paper. And he saw this. Finch's face went white. The mask of civility shattered completely, replaced by pure, undiluted rage. That's ridiculous. It's a child's fantasy. Now step aside. He lunged forward, trying to grab Sarah's arm. Before his hand could make contact, another figure moved. Silas, the sergeant-at-arms, stepped into his path. He didn't touch Finch. He didn't have to. He simply stood there, a human wall, his stare as hard and unyielding as granite. Two other sentinels moved to flank him, their arms crossed, their presence a silent and absolute negation. The path was closed. Finch recoiled as if he had hit a physical barrier. He looked around the room at the 30 silent men watching him, their expressions ranging from contempt to a cold, simmering anger. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer the respected benefactor in control. He was an intruder, a predator cornered. The air crackled with a tension that was thick enough to taste. The truth, raw and damning, lay uncurled on the floor, and a brotherhood of protectors had just declared themselves its guardians. Finch, realizing he was utterly powerless in this space, backed away, his face a contorted mess of fury and humiliation. He pointed a trembling finger at Sarah. "You will regret this," he hissed, his voice venomous. Then he turned and fled back into the storm, the heavy tavern door slamming shut behind him, leaving silence in his wake. The Sentinel's clubhouse became a fortress for Sarah and Leo, while the main room was a cavernous space filled with motorcycles in various states of repair, a long table for meetings, and the scent of gasoline and brotherhood. There was a small, quiet apartment upstairs reserved for emergencies. It was clean and sparse, but to Sarah it felt like the safest place on earth. Leo, for the first time in days, uncurled his small body from its defensive crouch. He found a corner, took out his sketchbook, and began to draw, his pencil a conduit for the fear and chaos he couldn't put into words. Downstairs, the club's leadership convened. Book spread Leo's drawings out on the heavy oak table under the stark light of a single bare bulb. They were more than just a child's sketches, they were a timeline. A drawing of unfamiliar trucks arriving at the demolition site in the dead of night. A sketch of Mr. Finch, shouting at a man who looked like Leo's father, the damning drawing of the payoff in the alley, and another, even more chilling, a detailed rendering of the support beams under the collapsed wall with cracks and rust, drawn with meticulous, heartbreaking accuracy. "This isn't just a kid's imagination," Book said, tapping the drawing of the alley exchange. "He's got details. Look at the logo on the hard hat. It's for a subcontractor Finch fired publicly 2 weeks before the collapse, claiming they did shoddy work. Why would they be meeting in secret?" He then pointed to another drawing, one of a truck unloading what looked like bags of concrete mix. "And this." He even drew a partial license plate on the truck. "It's just 3 letters and a number, but it's a start." Forge nodded, his gaze fixed on the drawing of the rusty support beams. "Leo's father was a good man, a careful man. He told me a month before it happened that he was worried about that site. Said Finch was cutting corners using substandard materials to save a buck. At the time, it had been just a conversation, a worker's complaint. Now it was testimony from the grave. Book knew their next move had to be precise, going to the police with a biker gang's suspicions, and a child's drawings would be dismissed out of hand. They needed an ally, someone on the inside who couldn't afford to ignore a credible lead. He thought of Detective Miller, a veteran cop on the verge of retirement, a man known for being cynical, cantankerous, and incorruptibly honest. Miller owed Book a small favor from years ago, when Book's legal research helped clear the detective's nephew of a wrongful charge. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. Book made the call. Miller's reaction was exactly as he'd predicted, skeptical and dismissive. "Let me get this straight, Marcus," Miller's gravelly voice crackled over the phone. "You want me to open an investigation into Alistair Finch, the man who just funded our new youth center, based on the word of a biker club and some crayon drawings." "It's more than that, David," Book said calmly. "The boy's father is dead. The kid is a witness. He drew a partial plate from a truck delivering non-certified concrete mix at night. VXN4. Run it, see what you find. If it's a dead end, I'll never bother you again." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Book could hear the weary sigh, the sound of a man who had seen too much to believe in easy answers, but was too good a cop to ignore a specific, verifiable detail. "VXN4, Miller repeated. "Fine, I'll run it, but this had better not be a waste of my time." The next day, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Leo's third-grade teacher, Ms. Albright, had been worried about him for weeks. He had become withdrawn, his usual bright-eyed curiosity replaced by a haunted, watchful silence. His drawings in class had grown darker, filled with shadows and crumbling buildings. After hearing whispers about a disturbance at the Crow's Nest involving the Finch family, she felt a professional and moral obligation to act. She went to the police station to file a report of concern. She was directed by chance to Detective Miller. She laid out Leo's recent class drawings on Miller's cluttered desk. They mirrored the ones the Sentinels had. One, in particular, caught his eye. It was a drawing of a man, Mr. Finch, handing a city official, identifiable by the seal on his briefcase, a set of golf clubs. Miller recognized the official. He was the city inspector who had signed off on the safety of the demolition site. The same inspector who had just purchased a new car that was well above his pay grade. Miller looked from the teacher's concerned face to the child's. Drawings. It was no longer just a biker's hunch. It was a pattern. He turned to his computer and ran the partial license plate, VXN4. The system pinged back a match. The truck was registered to a holding company, which was, in turn, owned by a subsidiary corporation. After 20 minutes of digging through digital records, he found the name at the bottom of the ownership chain, Alistair Finch. The truck, full of substandard materials, was his. The dam of Miller's skepticism began to crack, and a current of cold, righteous anger started to flow through. The investigation, once a trickle, now became a steady current. Detective Miller, armed with the license plate match and the inspector's identity, secured a quiet warrant to look into the finances of both Alistair Finch and the city building inspector. What he found was a carefully constructed web of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and illicit payments. The inspector had received a series of large, unexplained cash deposits immediately following his approval of the demolition permits. The supplier of the substandard concrete was a company that existed only on paper, its address a post office box, its sole purpose to funnel money back to Finch while providing dangerously inadequate materials. While Miller built his case brick by brick in the sterile world of legal documents and bank records, the Sentinels built a wall of protection around Leo and Sarah in the physical world. They were a constant, silent presence. A pair of bikes would be parked across the street from the clubhouse at all hours, their riders seemingly relaxed, but their eyes missing nothing. When Sarah needed to go to the grocery store, two members would escort her, one walking ahead, one behind, a quiet honor guard that discouraged any unwanted attention. They brought Leo a new set of art supplies, a professional-grade kit with colored pencils and charcoals. The boy spent hours at the big oak table, drawing not just the dark memories but the new reality around him. A portrait of Silas, his stern face softened by a small smile, a detailed sketch of the intricate engine of Forge's motorcycle, a picture of his mother for the first time in months, laughing as one of the members told a clumsy joke. He was documenting his rescue. News of the investigation began to leak, first as whispers in the town hall, then as a short, speculative article in the local newspaper. The community's reaction was fractured. Alistair Finch was a local titan. He had built the new park, sponsored the Little League teams, and was the single largest employer in the county. To many, he was untouchable, a benefactor being harassed by a notorious motorcycle club. His supporters wrote letters to the editor, defending his character and accusing the police of a witch hunt instigated by criminals. Skeptics saw it as a power play, the bikers trying to intimidate a legitimate businessman. Forge and the Sentinels knew they couldn't fight the battle in the court of public opinion with words, so they used the language they knew best, presence and symbolism. Forge organized a memorial ride for Leo's father and for two other workers who had died in accidents on Finch-owned sites over the past decade. It was not advertised as a protest. The flyer simply read, "A Ride to Remember." On a crisp Saturday morning, the rumble began. It started with the 30 members of the local chapter, their engines a low growl. But as they rode toward the town square, they were joined by others, Sentinels from neighboring counties, then from across the state. Other clubs, ones who shared a similar code of honor, joined the procession. By the time they reached the demolition site, the line of motorcycles stretched for over a mile. Hundreds of bikes, hundreds of riders, moving as one. They didn't shout, they didn't carry signs. They simply rode slowly past the chain-link fence, each rider turning to look at the pile of rubble where a man had lost his life. They paused, their engines idling in a deep, thunderous chorus, a deafening moment of silence that spoke volumes. The sheer scale of the event drew news crews from the city. The visual was stunningly powerful, a massive, disciplined army of bikers paying their respects and without a single word holding a powerful man accountable. The ride changed the town's atmosphere. People who had been afraid to speak now felt emboldened. An elderly woman who lived near the site called Miller's desk, telling him she'd seen trucks coming and going late at night for weeks before the collapse. A former employee of Finch's contacted a lawyer, stating he had been fired for refusing to use expired materials. The silent onlookers, the bystanders who had once hesitated, were starting to find their voices. The community, once divided by doubt, was beginning to unite behind the truth. A truth that had been given a voice by a small boy and amplified by the roar of engines. The public reckoning had begun. The memorial ride was the spark that lit the fire. The story, once a local curiosity, was now a regional headline. The image of hundreds of bikers in silent, disciplined procession was broadcast across the state, a potent symbol of solidarity that transcended stereotypes. Investigative journalists from major city newspapers descended on the town, sensing a story far deeper than a simple construction accident. They started digging into Finch's past projects, uncovering a pattern of safety violations, lawsuits settled out of court, and a disturbing number of workplace injuries that had been quietly dismissed. Detective Miller, now backed by the full resources of the district attorney's office, moved swiftly. The city inspector, faced with irrefutable evidence of bribery and the threat of a long prison sentence, confessed everything. He detailed how Finch had systematically bribed him and other officials for years to overlook safety codes, use substandard materials and rush projects to maximize profits. His testimony was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. Warrants were served. Finch's pristine corporate offices were raided. Boxes of documents and computer hard drives seized. Alistair Finch was arrested at his country club during a fundraising luncheon. The man who had built an empire on a foundation of lies was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage, the image a stark contrast to the benevolent philanthropist he had portrayed himself to be. The legal process ground forward, culminating in a grand jury indictment. Finch was charged with multiple counts of involuntary manslaughter, corporate fraud, racketeering, and bribery. The trial became the biggest event the county had seen in decades. The small-town courthouse was flooded with reporters, television crews, and curious townspeople. Through it all, the Sentinels maintained their quiet vigil. They didn't attend the trial in their club vests. That would be seen as intimidation. Instead, a few members at a time, dressed in plain clothes, would sit in the back of the courtroom, their stoic presence a silent reminder to the prosecution, the judge, and the jury. The truth is being watched. The most powerful moment of the trial came when the prosecution called its final witness, Leo. Guided by a gentle-voiced prosecutor, Leo walked to the witness stand, his sketchbook held tightly in his hands. He looked small and fragile in the cavernous wood-paneled room. Finch's high-priced defense attorney objected, arguing that the testimony of a child was unreliable. The judge, an old-school jurist with a reputation for fairness, overruled him. "The boy will be heard," she stated, her voice firm. Leo didn't use legal jargon. He didn't talk about statutes or evidence. He just told his story. He opened his sketchbook and, page by page, explained his drawings. "This is the truck that came at night," he said, his voice clear and steady. It had a V and a 4 on the license plate. He turned the page. "This is Mr. Finch. He's yelling because the man didn't want to use the rusty poles." He turned the page again to the drawing of the alley. "And this is when he gave the man with the hard hat the money." He looked angry. The other man looked sad. He didn't need to interpret. The drawings spoke for themselves, a pure, unvarnished record of what he had seen. The jury was captivated. They weren't just looking at a child's drawings. They were seeing the events through the eyes of an innocent. And the truth, in its simple, brutal clarity, was undeniable. When the defense attorney tried to confuse him on cross-examination, asking him about fantasy and make-believe, Leo simply looked at him and said, "I don't draw things that aren't real. I just draw what I see." The verdict came after only 3 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. As the word was spoken, a collective gasp went through the courtroom. Sarah wept silently, her hand held tightly by Book, who sat beside her. In the back, Forge and Silas exchanged a single, solemn nod. Justice, for once, had not been blind. It had been forced to see, its eyes opened by the courage of a small boy who dared to draw the truth. Alistair Finch was sentenced to the maximum term, his empire crumbling into dust, his name now a synonym for greed and corruption. The system, so often a tool for the powerful, had been wielded by the powerless, and it had worked. The conviction of Alistair Finch was not an ending, it was a beginning. The shock waves from the trial radiated outward, forcing a deep and uncomfortable self-examination within the town and its institutions. The corruption Finch had cultivated couldn't exist in a vacuum. His fall exposed the rot that had taken hold in the city's regulatory bodies. The city council, facing immense public pressure and media scrutiny, launched a full-scale internal affairs investigation. 2 more building inspectors and a zoning commissioner were fired and subsequently indicted for accepting bribes. The most significant change came in the form of new legislation. A grassroots community organization, led by Ms. Albright and supported by a coalition of local unions and concerned citizens, drafted a proposal for a new set of building safety regulations. They called it Leo's Law. The law mandated unannounced independent third-party inspections for all major construction projects, established a confidential whistleblower hotline for workers to report safety concerns without fear of retaliation, and significantly increased the legal penalties for corporate negligence leading to injury or death. After a series of tense and emotional town hall meetings, the city council unanimously passed the ordinance. Safety, which had been a negotiable expense for men like Finch, was now a non-negotiable mandate. The Sentinels, who had been the catalyst for this transformation, retreated from the spotlight, their work done. But their role in the community had been irrevocably changed. They were no longer seen as a menacing fringe element, but as silent guardians. The fear and suspicion they once faced were replaced by nods of respect and quiet gratitude. They continued their work, but with a new sense of purpose. Using funds from a series of statewide charity rides, they established a foundation called Leo's Shield. The nonprofit provided pro bono legal services and financial support to families who had lost loved ones in workplace accidents, ensuring that no other family would have to face a corporate giant alone and without resources. The physical landscape of the town changed as well. The old mill site, the scene of the tragedy, was cleared. A new developer, one with a reputation for integrity and quality, took over the project. They worked closely with the community, and at the entrance to the new complex of shops and apartments, they built a small memorial park. In the center of the park was a simple granite bench, dedicated to the memory of Leo's father and the other workers who had died. It was a quiet, permanent reminder of the cost of greed and the importance of vigilance. For Leo and Sarah, the changes were more personal and profound. With the settlement from the lawsuit against Finch's now bankrupt company, they were able to buy a small house with a yard on a quiet, tree-lined street. The shadows that had haunted their small apartment were gone, replaced by sunlight streaming through clean windows. Sarah, no longer burdened by the constant weight of fear and uncertainty, began to heal. She took a part-time job at the local library and started volunteering at the community center, helping others navigate the very systems that had almost failed her. She found her strength not in forgetting the past, but in using its lessons to build a better future. The ripples of Leo's courage had not just reformed a town's laws, they had rebuilt a family's life, transforming their world from one of fear and isolation into one of safety, hope, and connection. A year passed. The seasons turned, washing the town clean. Autumn leaves gave way to winter snow, which melted into the green blush of spring. The new rhythms of life settled in, quiet and steady. The house on Elm Street was filled with the smell of baking cookies and the faint, pleasant scent of turpentine from Leo's art supplies. His drawings no longer depicted crumbling walls and shadowy men. They were vibrant, filled with color and light. He drew landscapes of the rolling hills outside town, portraits of his friends from school, and fantastical images of dragons and spaceships. His sketchbook was no longer a record of fear, but a celebration of a world he now felt safe in. On a warm Saturday afternoon in late May, the low, familiar rumble of motorcycles echoed down the street. It wasn't the thunderous roar of a full procession, but the friendly thrum of two bikes. Forge and Silas parked their gleaming motorcycles at the curb. They weren't wearing their club vests, their cuts. They were dressed in jeans and plain t-shirts, looking less like enforcers and more like the uncles they had become. Leo burst out of the front door, a baseball glove on his hand and a wide grin on his face. "You're here," he shouted. Forge swung off his bike, his movement still powerful but now imbued with a gentle ease. He ruffled Leo's hair, a gesture of deep, quiet affection. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, kid. Big game today." Silas, leaning against his bike with his arms crossed, gave a rare, genuine smile. "Heard you're pitching. Gotta make sure the ump isn't making any bad calls." Sarah came out onto the porch, carrying a plate of cookies. She offered them to the two men, her eyes filled with a gratitude that words could never fully capture. They had become a part of her family, a constant grounding, presence in their lives. They weren't just protectors anymore, they were friends. They showed up for baseball games, helped fix a leaky faucet, and sat at the kitchen table, listening to Leo excitedly explain the plot of his latest favorite book. They had built a family not from blood, but from a shared commitment to a simple, powerful truth. You show up for those you care about. As Leo and the two men walked toward the park, Sarah went back inside. On the kitchen table, held down by a salt shaker, was Leo's latest drawing. It was a picture of his new, sprawling, unconventional family. In the center was him, holding hands with his mom. On either side of them, stretching to the edges of the paper, were rows of large bearded men on motorcycles. Every single one of them, rendered in bright, cheerful colors, was smiling under a brilliant yellow sun. It was a picture of safety, a picture of love, a promise made in a dark, rain-swept tavern, and a promise that had been quietly, faithfully kept. The world is made better not by grand gestures, but by the small, courageous acts of those who refuse to look away, those who see a child in the storm and decide to become the harbor.